This week, we'll be exploring mysteries that range from one of, if not the most disturbing account, of a very unhinged person and their mission to destroy a demon portal in the catacombs beneath Paris, to this terrifying, very mysterious creature whose sightings actually likely inspired a bunch of H.P. Lovecraft's creatures, to the tragic tale of a young couple who were mysteriously killed for seemingly no reason, and in a very strange manner, out in a Virginia National Park. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is Darjeeling tea with milk, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. Robert Williams was a very tragic and mysterious case where a 15-year-old boy, Robert Williams, went missing from Neath in Wales in 2002. His mum last saw him when he was heading out for the day at around morning time, and he told his mum that he would be out for a while, which wasn't too untypical of Robert, as, you know, he was quite a social, active kid. So he left the house, and where he went after that is kind of unclear. We know that he did attend a house party at one point, but where he went before that, and also where he went after that, and, you know, where he ended up, we still really, to this day, don't really know. He seemingly just completely vanished, and it's not really known whether he vanished from the party itself, or whether he attended the party and then left to go somewhere and then vanished from there, or whether he just disappeared from somewhere else entirely. And this was 22 years ago, bear in mind. And in that entire time, they pretty much hadn't got any major leads until September of last year, where two people were arrested in connection to his disappearance. Now, the identities of these two people are at the moment undisclosed, and there's not too many details out there about them, but we do know that they are a 59-year-old woman and a 35-year-old man, meaning 21 years ago at the time of his disappearance, this would put them at 38 and 14 years of age, which some people have rightfully pointed out that this man, who was 14 years old at the time, may very well have been one of Robert's friends, acquaintances, schoolmates, as Robert himself was just a year older at 15. And the woman could very likely be this kid's mum, or this ex-kid. It's a strange way of saying adult, but I think it fits here. So did this kid perhaps know what happened to Robert? If they're being arrested for it, does it perhaps mean that they are somewhat, if not entirely, responsible? You know, maybe they gave Robert some drink, maybe something much worse, and he ended up, you know, dying in their custody. So perhaps they just covered the whole thing up. Or perhaps, as some people have said, maybe they got into a fight. Maybe it was a play fight, maybe it was a real fight. But either way, they took it too far, an accident happened, and Robert ended up dying. And this kid's mum ended up helping him hide the body, and in her eyes, protect her son from doing jail time. To me, a lot of these theories actually make sense. And as I said, the evidence isn't really out there at the moment. The details around these people also isn't really out there. So we will have to likely wait a little while to see how this develops, but hopefully this leads to some more arrests, some more breakthroughs in the case, and Robert's family can finally find out 22 years later what actually happened to their boy. The Ross-Littlewood Paradox, also known as the balls and vase problem, also known as the ping pong ball problem. Yeah, a lot of strange names. But this is once again another math problem. Yay, maths. So it's quite a complex one, but not as abstract as some of the other ones I've covered. So I think I can briefly explain it quite simply. It basically deals with infinity and how the concept of infinity is just super nutso for our brain to handle. So the balls and vase problem says that basically you have this hypothetical vase, say our mug here, and just imagine this mug is like infinite size. So first you put 10 balls into the mug, and then you remove one ball, which is a pretty simple little series of events. Then you put in 10 balls, and then you remove another ball, and you do this over and over and over and over again an infinite amount of times. And the question is, at the end of this infinite set of actions, how many balls will actually be in the vase? And that is basically the entire puzzle. Some say, well, you've added balls to the vase an infinite amount of times, so there are an infinite amount of balls currently in the vase. Others say, well, the last step every time is actually to remove one ball, and since you're doing it an infinite amount of times, you end up removing an infinite amount of balls from the vase. And so, since you've removed an infinite amount of balls from the vase, at the end of this sequence, the vase ends with 0 balls. And this is where the concept of infinity gets a little strange, I think, because you can't sum up infinities in quite the same way you can do with whole numbers. So like, just because you've added 10 balls an infinite amount of times, it doesn't necessarily mean there's like 10 times infinity balls. Like, there's still just infinity. So when you remove one, it's not exactly like you're removing 1/10 of the balls, because again, you can't really have 1/10 of an infinite number. And if this is starting to hurt your brains a little bit, I do apologize. Infinity is a insane concept. And for this reason, there is a, third common answer to this question, which is that the answer is ill-defined because the question itself is ill-defined. As because it is an infinite string of tasks or actions, this means that it will never actually end. And since the actions of putting in balls and removing them never actually ends, the answer to how many balls are in the vase at the end is just kind of a poorly constructed question. It's like asking what color is the number 4. It just doesn't make sense to ask that sort of question. But regardless of where you stand on the answer to this question, it is mostly just designed as a way to get people to think, to conceive infinity, to think outside the box, to stretch their minds sort of thing. And in terms of the math world, it is very useful, but the answer is somewhat very mysterious, and it does hurt my head a little bit. The Skegness Bus Woman. So this was kind of an obscure case where, while on a bus heading to Skegness, which is this area in East England, 2 men on the bus got up and ended up, through some unknown series of events, shaking hands with this old woman. And then when they got off the bus, they realized that their hands had these puncture wounds on that were apparently from shaking hands with this old woman. They then rushed to the hospital to, make sure they weren't dying or anything. They did some checks, the tests all came back fine, and they were just told that, bandage them up, the puncture wounds would heal up soon. But the old lady on the bus was never found or questioned, and it's still unclear to this day whether she intentionally assaulted and injured these 2 men, stabbing them in the hand for whatever reason, or whether it was just a sheer accident. Maybe she had a sharp bracelet on or something, and their hands ended up getting punctured. As I said, kind of an obscure case, not too much to go on this one, but it is still a fairly unique and interesting mystery. Skyquakes are basically what they sound like, earthquakes, but in the sky. They are normally described as something like thunder, but without the accompanying lightning, and are often, but not always, seen in perfectly clear skies. So obviously the cause for them is somewhat of a mystery. They occur basically worldwide, and since they occur worldwide, there are a bunch of different names for them from languages all around the world. They are called, for instance, the bombs of the sea in France, uminari or cries of the sea in Japan, mist poofers in Dutch, which is a hilarious name, fog guns, and much, much more. The cause for them hasn't yet been conclusively identified, but possible causes range from meteors entering the atmosphere, to the atmosphere itself kind of shifting or changing, to perhaps unseen volcanic eruptions or earthquakes, to a bunch of stuff possibly going on underneath the ground, underneath the water, like perhaps some escaping gas, or the collapsing of some underground caves. For me, a very interesting phenomenon, and one that I think might possibly have multiple explanations, but you can let me know your reasonable explanations in the comments below, or if you want to, your completely absurd theories about this one. And actually, I think I'll end up pinning the most entertaining one that I see. So no prize here, just fame and glory in the YouTube comment section. The Awful is actually a very appropriately named creature. It is this chimera-like beast that was first seen in Vermont in roughly the 1920s. It had a snake tail, these giant claws, an awful, see what I did there? An awful, terrifying head, and these huge wings that spanned up to 20 feet in width. It wasn't a bird, so I don't know why it would make bird noises. The first time it was spotted was when 2 sawmill workers who were crossing a bridge saw it up on a rooftop. They saw this thing up there staring down at them, and one of the men got so badly frightened that he immediately had a heart attack, which, yeah, that is pretty frightening. It wasn't really seen much after the 1930s, although there have been a few apparent sightings, some up as late as like 2006. And interestingly enough, when news of the awful started to come out, started to spread, H.P. Lovecraft actually made his way over to Vermont, over to this town, to try and spot the awful. And it is thought that the accounts of the awful that H.P. Lovecraft got from the news, got from local people, got from rumors going around, from people actually spotting this creature, that all of these accounts basically went on to inspire H.P. Lovecraft in a bunch of the creatures and monsters that he ended up eventually creating. So, an interesting creature with a little bit of history. Was it just a hoax? Was it a pterodactyl-like creature? You know, a lost species, an ancient dinosaur? Was it perhaps an alien? Was it a giant bird? Was it an experiment? Or was it in fact a mythical griffin / chimera? The jury's kind of out, so I'll let you guys decide. If you are enjoying this video, do consider hitting that like button and subscribing if you like this sort of content. There are some really cool videos coming out in the next few months, which I would hate for you to miss out on. Let me know what you're drinking down below, and for now, let's get back to the video. The Simpsons comic Find Ned Flanders in this panel. So here we have another Screamer video. This is one, as you can imagine, in which the viewer is tasked with basically finding Ned Flanders in this comic book panel. And this panel is kind of like a Where's Waldo sort of thing. You know, you've got to look closely at the page, you've got to scour every little detail, and while you're really up close to it, searching really carefully for Ned Flanders, bam! A jump scare. And I'm pretty sure from the description that this is the face that was shown in the jump scare, along with this massively loud scream. But the video is no longer available on YouTube for whatever reasons, and so it is currently considered lost media. Tiffany Nelson was a 9-year-old girl who went missing from Augusta, Georgia in 1994. She was living with her auntie at the time, and it was a fairly normal, fairly standard summer's day, and Tiffany decided to head to the shops. So she got on her red bike that she was given for Christmas and headed towards the convenience store, which was really just a few minutes away. And after she left the house, she was never seen again, or rather she was never seen alive again. The next time she turned up was 14 years later, when some hunters who were out and about roaming, as hunters tend to do, found some bones, and through DNA tests, these were confirmed to be Tiffany's. There is honestly very little evidence for this case, very few suspects, and it is not currently known what exactly happened to Tiffany or who was responsible for Tiffany's death. One theory that actually originated from her older brother Tyrone was that he himself was indirectly responsible for Tiffany's death. And this all came out years after Tiffany's disappearance, but he basically told his auntie that there was this horrible guilt eating away at him, and he said that he was responsible for Tiffany's disappearance and death. He said that he was into, you know, the herb and a bunch of other stuff, shall we say, and that back then, all those years ago, he ended up doing business with a man and his wife, and then he decided to beat the man up very badly, and he ended up taking back both the stuff and the money. So he basically beat him up and robbed him, and that he was convinced that because he had done this, that they had, you know, sought out revenge, somehow found out where he lived, and it was someone connected to these people that ended up kidnapping Tiffany and killing her. Which, I mean, to me, this whole thing just sounds like the big brother beating himself up and guilting himself over not being able to protect his little sister. You know, it's easy sometimes to look at things that you've done wrong as potentially the cause for something like this. And I'm not saying this isn't necessarily what happened, but it could just be not connected whatsoever, and the brother could very understandably just feel very guilty about what actually happened. There was also, on top of this, a call that came through to 911, and this was sometime after Tiffany's disappearance, and the call itself and the voice was kind of muffled. So they recorded the whole thing and ended up playing back the voice to Tiffany's mother, saying, you know, can you confirm if this is Tiffany or not? And that whole confirmation was a little bit up in the air, but the call itself was apparently the voice of a little girl who said that she was taken from her home and she wants to go back home, and she said that 2 people took her and actually gave their names, but the names she gave were also somewhat muffled, and so police weren't really able to identify these 2 names, which isn't really ideal. Some theories say that the 2 names that the girl gave were the names of 2 of Tyrone's friends, and that they actually had, something to do with this, which is, totally possible, but absolutely nothing that would hold up in court. And others do say that it is a tiny bit of a stretch, and that the phone call is really just so muffled that you could almost apply any name to them, which is also a very good point. The end of this phone call just hangs up abruptly, which makes it seem almost like the person making the call panicked and just hung up, or the call was hung up for them. Tiffany herself was an absolute bundle of joy. She was always smiling, always happy, always kind, and sadly, as you know, as I've just told you, the case has not yet been solved, though it is still open, and 30 years later, the investigations into it still continue. The Trades Hall bombing. So this was a seemingly targetless random attack in Trades Hall, Wellington, New Zealand in 1984. This suitcase was left in the lobby of the building by we don't really know who, and when the caretaker of the building discovered it and went to move it, the suitcase just immediately exploded. The blast was equivalent to roughly 1 kilogram of dynamite, which is a powerful explosion, and the motive and culprit for this attack has never been found or determined. This building, the Trades Hall, was the headquarters for a bunch of different trade unions, so it is thought that the person behind this attack likely, for some reason, didn't like trade unions. Perhaps he even passionately hated them, in order to justify doing something like this. It's not like he just disliked them or he was protesting, like he literally killed someone over this. The police had like 1 or 2 quite weak leads on the case, and neither of these really panned out. But as I said, police were convinced that whoever did this likely hated the trade unions, and likely the trade unions were the target of their attack. So maybe it was a former worker for one of these trade unions. Maybe he owned a company that the trade unions were interfering with. Maybe he was just late for work one day due to a tube or train strike or something. Nobody really knows. But a strange case, a very sad case for the caretaker that was killed, Ernie Abbott. And due to just how this case is structured, it seems unlikely that it'll be solved really anytime soon, if ever. The Triassic Kraken. And when I read this for the first time, I actually read it as the Triassic Karen, which would have been interesting. I don't know if dinosaurs had managers that a Karen could complain to back in the Triassic era, but no, this was the Triassic Kraken, which was theorized to be a kraken as large as a school bus that lived back in the Triassic Age. It was first proposed by a paleontologist, Mark McMenamin, which is a hell of a name, man. But he found this squid beak, which he said, due to its size, must have belonged to a giant kraken or octopus or squid from that era that was between 10 and 30 meters in length. And I guess the more wild part of this discovery and proposal is the discovery of some of these bones, which actually belonged to these creatures, the Shonisaurus. Now, bear with me here because it does get a tiny bit confusing, but octopuses have kind of been known to decorate their homes sort of thing. Grab things, grab stones, grab shells, just place things around. And so Mark said that these bones, the bones of the Shonisaurus, the way they were laid out was very artistic. And so these bones couldn't have been placed there by accident, but were the result of this giant kraken killing a few Shonisauruses and then decorating its home with their bones as something like artwork, I guess, around the kraken's home, which Christ, that is a wild theory. And there are a few things that are quite wrong with it, as the theory has been attacked by some other prominent scientists and paleontologists. One being that octopuses don't really make artwork around their home, but really they just kind of grab random things that are around, scatter them around their home, around the entrances to their home, to basically act as a camouflage, so their entrance isn't super obvious as an entrance. There's other random bits and bobs scattered all around there. 2, the tooth that he found, that he said was evidence for this giant kraken-like creature, actually seems to be, upon further inspection, smaller than he originally claimed, meaning that the squid or kraken that he proposed was also likely a lot smaller than he originally proposed. And even if this Kraken creature was as large as he said, as large as a school bus, it'd still only really be a few tons in weight, while the Shonisauruses were thought to be an estimated 20 to 30 tons in weight, and they typically hunted and killed large squids. So yeah, even if this thing did exist, it likely would have been lunch to these Shonisauruses, and so the idea of this giant Kraken killing these Shonisauruses is firstly absurd, and then decorating its home with their bones, like some kind of flex or something, is seemingly just all sorts of nonsense. So a wild theory by apparently an even wilder dude, but there you go. U/SnappedFingers. So this is a absolutely wild and disturbing case. And shout out to Eudoxia for basically investigating this case and putting together a fantastic video covering it. Link in the description below if you'd like to check it out, or in fact check out any of his other stuff. His channel is honestly fantastic. But if you do go there, leave him a comment saying that Connor sent you. But SnappedFingers was the name of this Reddit user who posted many posts, roughly like 4 to 5 years ago, and these posts paint the story of this seriously unhinged and disturbed individual. I won't go into too many graphic details about this one, as it does honestly get a little gruesome, but our story starts about SnappedFingers all the way back in 2019-2020. This was in the confession Reddit, and he confessed that since as far back as he can remember, he has seen things and heard things that weren't really there. So, you know, voices, what he thought were demons, and one time he was putting up a set of shelves, and then he saw this black demon-like thing crawling up his arm, and he panicked and tried to stop this demon, and so the drill that he was holding, he ended up just jamming that into his arm, which apparently stopped the demon, but also meant he needed to go to the hospital. And he told them it was an accident. He got the wound treated. It wasn't super fatal or anything like that, but yeah, he said he lied to them at the time and told them it was a complete accident because he didn't want to seem crazy. Then he made posts about how he always saw these illusions, these demons, and had seemingly witnessed some pretty disturbing things in the past, like for instance someone getting hit by a train, and said he didn't really react or feel anything at all, which honestly might be the sign of a psychopath or sociopath, or someone with just massive trauma who has basically numbed themselves. And although he said a bunch of his relatives, a bunch of the people he spoke to, believed in stuff like ghosts and supernatural beings, etc., SnappedFingers said he never really did believe in those things, and instead said he believed these things that were attacking him were actually interdimensional beings, which I'll use interdimensional beings and demons kind of interchangeably throughout this, but that is where he thought that they came from, and they thought that they were, for lack of a better word, haunting him, stalking him, attacking him, and just generally harassing him. So he got to talking to multiple people on multiple different forums, on Reddit, obviously, on various Discord servers, and he would ask them for help, and they would basically just troll him. A few people told him that in order to fight off and keep these demons away from him, that he needed to basically offer a piece of himself to, you know, satiate their hunger. Like, for example, drawing blood, like cutting off one of his fingers. So yeah, some incredible, irresponsible advice to give someone over the internet. And he kind of seemed to be naive enough to believe some of these things, but he was still seemingly scared and a little cautious about following through on some of these. Most of the comments, to be fair, were trying to get this guy help, saying, you know, these people on Discord are trying to fool you, they're trying to trick you, they're just trolling you, they don't care about you, and telling him, look, get off the internet, get off these forums, and go seek medical help. And he actually said that he had been on medication before, but that firstly, it didn't really help, which actually just further proved to himself that these demons were real, because he said if it were all in his head, then the medicine would have stopped them, which is not a fantastic thing to think. And he also said he didn't want to be seen as crazy by doctors, so he just didn't go to them. He basically says that he has no one else in his life to discuss these things with, and so these Redditors and Discord users are all that he has. And someone does bring up the question of, you know, are you sober now? Are you on anything? And he said he's never really on anything. He doesn't even drink coffee, he said. So it seems like whatever was causing these delusions wasn't external. He then goes on for multiple posts about how he's new to this whole interdimensional demon thing, and he's looking for advice on how to protect himself from them, how to quiet them or make them happy, and how to kill and destroy them. And as we mentioned earlier, there were some people saying that he needed to sacrifice a piece of himself, whether that be a finger, whether that be an entire limb, which is again so stupidly irresponsible. And he's constantly doubting it and saying he kind of believes them, but he's not really sure, and so he's looking for basically further validation on this all. And he comes across, at least to me, as just very disturbed, very naive, and somewhat very scared. He then gets convinced somehow that there is a portal to hell, or to these interdimensional demons in the catacombs beneath Paris, and that all of these demons that have been harassing him basically his entire life all come from that portal. And so he has a plan to fly over to Paris and basically destroy it. Yeah, some wild stuff. And this was all happening during the crazy stuff that happened in 2020. So there were a bunch of places and things that were on lockdown, a bunch of airports that were closed, and so he basically had to take a flight over somewhat illegally, and then later says that these demons actually released the thing that was, released in 2020 upon the world for the sole purpose of shutting down these airports and of stopping SnappedFingers from getting to Paris and destroying the portal, which it's like, I thought these delusions couldn't get any more delusional, but he has clearly proved me wrong. And this all sounds, very extreme, somewhat funny. Like if you're just reading it, if you think it's a prank or a joke or something, it is very absurd. But people like this do provably exist. And so you have to think, if this person was being genuine and they were truly, honestly believing this, going through with this, if you imagine one of your loved ones in this exact scenario, then it is extremely sad and heartbreaking to experience and watch. He eventually, according to his posts, makes it to Paris. He lives, rough on the streets, traveling for a few days or a few weeks, it's a little unclear. He says he came unprepared, he didn't really bring enough money for the trip, and he was worried that he was going to get caught or end up having to go back to America, empty-handed. And the demons at this point, he said, were getting more aggressive, more agitating, and were harassing him more and more and more aggressively, because he said they knew why he was in Paris, and they knew how close he was to destroying the portal, and basically the source of their power and source of their existence. So he seems to be going through a very rough time. And eventually, finally, he posts this, which you can pause it and read it all if you wish, but he basically says about how he made it to Paris, and that he was preparing to enter the catacombs, and will actually enter them within a few hours. And he has some, idea of how he's going to destroy the portals once he gets down there. And then after this post, he basically just goes radio silent, and nothing is really heard from him for a few years. And then he finally comes out, posts again, and says that he is sorry for all the drama that he caused, for all of the worry and stress that he caused everyone, and that what happened on that night was that he barely made it down into the catacombs, and he ended up finding no portals, and is now seeking help for what he knows to be illusions now, or delusions, sorry. And yeah, that's basically the end of it. Again, you can pause and read this if you wish, but he basically admits that he knows now it was all a delusion. He apologizes to everyone for the hassle caused, and says that he is currently getting medical help, which is very good. And after this post, this was the last time he was officially heard from again. A few people are convinced that he was actually being hunted down by interdimensional demons, but it's hard to tell whether these people are actually being sincere or not. But most people basically fall into two camps. One, that the entire thing was a hoax, a prank committed by someone just to fool the internet and mess around with them. Or two, that this SnappedFingers individual was a genuinely unstable, unhinged person who was being sincere and honest the entire time, and who genuinely needed help. And for me, it is a little tough to say on this one, honestly. It is on the internet, and as we all know, stuff on the internet can be sometimes hard to tell whether it's, real or not. But at the same time, it could very well have been a, unstable person making these posts. As we know, people like this do exist, so someone like this being on the internet making posts isn't, completely out of the realm of possibility. Some people think that the original SnappedFingers account was actually hacked, and so these posts that were posted like 2 years after, the ones I showed saying that he was sorry and that he's getting help now, that these weren't actually by the original user, but were by whoever hacked their account, which, is possible, but I don't know why you'd hack an account and post something like this. Like, surely you'd want to kind of egg up the drama sort of thing, but we have no real way of proving this. But if the last post of them was saying they'd go down into the catacombs and destroy these portals, then there are obviously theories about what actually happened to this individual. Whether they found the portals and were, killed by the demons, whether they ended up getting lost or trapped in the catacombs, whether they were arrested or, picked up and taken to a facility either in France or in America. There's almost no evidence or clues for any of this, which leads to a bunch of different theories on it. It's unlikely we'll ever really get a solid answer for this one, but boy, this was a deep rabbit hole of a case. And yeah, once again, I couldn't have done it without Eudoxia's video and coverage. So check out his stuff if you're interested. He does some fantastic videos, and definitely show him some love. The Ulster County John Doe. So this was a man who was found dead, decomposed in 1988, New York. He, obviously being a John Doe, was unidentified, but found on him were clothes that he was obviously wearing that seemed to be French. So naturally, police first thought him to be a Frenchman, but also on him, they found this, which is obviously a photograph of not necessarily him. They said it was possibly him because the man had decomposed quite a bit. They said that the man in the photograph was possibly him, but possibly another man, maybe a relative, maybe a friend, maybe just someone random. We don't really know. And a child. Neither the man in the photo or the child were able to be identified, and so to this day, the man that was found still remains a John Doe. The Wallowa Lake freshwater crustaceans. So these were these giant crabs, essentially, that were mentioned by early settlers and explorers in Oregon. And then these giant crustaceans were just, I guess, never seen again. Like, they seemingly just vanished into thin air. The described size of these things would make them larger than any crab we have ever seen before. And yeah, what happened to them is still unknown. Maybe they were wiped out by humans or another animal. Maybe they ended up migrating when the humans came and are still undiscovered. Or maybe these settlers just, exaggerated the size of these crabs and they weren't really as big as they said they were. We don't really know, but what we absolutely do know is that giant crabs would be absolutely terrifying. Honestly, look at this bloody thing called the Sandwalker. Just nightmare fuel. The Warminster Thing is not too terrifying of a name, I guess. But this was basically a series of UFO sightings that happened in the 1960s in Warminster, England. Now, it should be noted that Warminster is only like 15 minutes away from Stonehenge, which, take from that what you will, but aliens, Stonehenge, all I'm saying is there might be something here. So on this day in 1964, it was Christmas Day, and Mildred Head woke up, this was in the middle of the night, and heard this crazy loud racket on the top of her roof. So she got up to kind of check what it was. She looked out the window, but just saw absolutely nothing. Then she heard a loud humming noise that got louder and louder and louder, and then just faded away. Yeah, I know. Spooky stuff. There was another lady who was knocked down to the ground by the force of, and I quote, savage sound waves, which is just hilarious. That's how I imagine savage sound waves to sound. Some soldiers in a nearby army camp witnessed something similar to this, in that there were loud, massive disturbances on one of their roofs, as did a man named Roger Rump and his wife, which... Roger Rump sounds like a made-up name, but those are just the names you get here in England. All in all, on Christmas Day that year, there were more than 30 reported similar cases of strange noises and strange hums and disturbances and rooftop incidents. Now, I know what you're thinking. Loud whoosh noises, people being knocked over, windows rattling. This all could just be the wind. And to that I say no, because just a few days later, an entire flock of pigeons died, just suddenly, mysteriously, out of nowhere. And as we all know, wind cannot kill pigeons because they, live in wind. It'd be like a fish drowning. So therefore, this Warminster Thing is not wind. A month after this, more families heard strange disturbances, strange things up on the roof. And a few months after that, a bunch of people noticed and witnessed things flying in the sky, seemingly UFOs, sightings like that. And some described what they saw as a cigar-shaped craft. Some saw other crafts that were blinking or covered in lights. Some said that they saw, try and imagine this, 2 red-hot pokers hanging down, one on top of the other, which is an incredible way to describe something. The sightings became more and more numerous until in the summer, the news spread about this thing going on in this small little town. And in one weekend, an estimated 8,000 people came from all over the country to this small little town in order to perhaps investigate for themselves, perhaps catch a glimpse of one of these strange sightings. This photo was taken by a local resident of what he believed to be a UFO, and then it was posted on the local newspaper and then on the national newspaper, and then things, no pun intended, maybe slightly intended, things just got crazier and busier than ever before. There were books written about these events and sightings. The BBC made a documentary on it. There were shops set up, there was merchandise developed and made, there were UFO tours arranged in this town. It was like a genuine little attraction within the town. People would come from all over the country to come and take part. But this only really lasted a few years, and by the mid-1970s, sightings slowly became less and less numerous. People stopped filming, they stopped writing books about it, and the tourists to the town just slowly slowed down, and people eventually stopped coming. There are still a few UFO sightings in Warminster, often kind of 1 or 2 every few years or so, but nowhere near as numerous as the 1960s. It is more well known now for its, quaint buildings, a few of its sites, and the scenery in the town, which, is kind of sad. This super cool, almost UFO town is no longer really known for that. But it is part of life, I guess, part of change, and we have to accept that. A really cool little period of time for this town, but it is still unknown as to what actually caused these and what the Warminster Thing actually was. The X17 particle was this proposed hypothetical particle that might help to explain and actually be connected to dark matter. That lovely, mysterious matter that makes up 85% of all matter in the universe, and we can't see it, can't really directly observe it, and can only somewhat measure it through estimates and complex math. So that's fun and not terrifying at all. But basically, and I'll try and simplify this down as I do with a lot of these complex entries, but they were basically doing a test, and there was this anomaly in the results of the test. And basically one way to explain this anomaly is by the existence of this proposed particle. Now, one of the reasons why this particle is and might be super special is that if it exists, its existence and behavior might help explain more of what dark matter is, and might potentially be evidence for a 5th force. So right now we have electromagnetism, we have gravity, and we have strong and weak nuclear forces. And these are the 4 forces in the universe. But as I said, this particle might actually end up proving a 5th force. So some super fun stuff that might actually end up being a massive scientific breakthrough. But for now, the potential existence of this particle and the cause of that anomaly in the test that they did is still an unsolved mystery. The Yakima Jane Doe was a lady likely in her 20s, found in Yakima, Washington in 1977. She had been found in a van that was seemingly abandoned in this parking lot, and at the time she was quite heavily mutilated, and she was badly decomposed, which made identifying her somewhat difficult. The case itself was honestly a bit of a mess as well, as they ended up losing or misplacing her dental records. There was a janitor who ended up throwing out her clothes, so evidence, which is some fantastic security you have there. And on top of that, her skull ended up going missing. So great. She was likely strangled to death just based on the injuries, and that's about really as far as they got with the case. And as I said, she was found in 1977, so she has been basically unidentified for the past 46 years, and this honestly looks like a case that probably will never be solved. Ślizgawka v Łazienkach is firstly a really hard name to say, but this was possibly the first ever Polish film made. It was directed by a guy named... here we go again. Kazimierz Pruszyński. And this was in 1896. Well, 1896 at the absolute latest. It could have been a few years before this. And interestingly enough, it was actually filmed on a very early prototype of a camera that he himself, the director, actually invented. So yeah, some super cool stuff. It was a super short film, I guess you could say, around 1 to 3 minutes long. And it featured a group of ice skaters skating around an ice rink in Warsaw. These 4 frames here are all that remain of the film, as they were posted in an early newspaper article. But where the rest of the film is to this day, we have no idea. It may very well have just been lost to time, with the old film either having been destroyed or decayed or lost, or it might still be around somewhere, either in the back of someone's attic sort of thing, or in a collection somewhere, but we really have no idea, and so this is a very early form of lost media. Tammy Lynn Leppert was the tragic, sad case of this 18-year-old girl, model, actress, beauty queen, who went missing in Florida 1983. Now, she, as I said, was a beauty queen. She had been a lot of her life modeling or acting, and she had been in actually quite a few films, albeit in minor roles, but she was in stuff like Scarface, she was in a film called Little Darlings, and in one called Spring Break. And so this whole case basically starts after the filming of Spring Break. This was in 1983, and after the filming was done, Tammy, who was apparently looking for a little break of her own, decided to head to this party all alone. And something happened there. We're not sure what, but after this party, Tammy's friends and family noticed that Tammy was acting pretty strange. Like, ever since this party, she wasn't acting herself, she seemed a little paranoid, she seemed scared often, and her mother was convinced that Tammy was fearing for her life, basically. And whatever happened at that party seemingly convinced Tammy that there was someone out to get her, that she was in danger, and that she would eventually be either kidnapped, killed, or both. Her mum, understandably being obviously worried for Tammy, first had her check in with a medical professional to see if it wasn't, all in her head. And the medical professionals did some checks, they did, minor investigation sort of thing, and they said she was basically fine to go and released her after 3 days. So that leads us to July 6th that same year. And this day, July 6th, was when Tammy was last seen alive. She was on the day being driven somewhere by a male friend of hers, and this male friend picked her up at her home and was driving her somewhere when the two had an argument in the car. This led to him stopping the car, her getting out at this parking lot, and he was the last person to see Tammy alive. The guy who dropped her off was obviously investigated, but they didn't really move forward with him as a suspect. They thought he likely didn't commit this crime, but Tammy's mother did say later on that Tammy said that she was afraid of this guy, her male friend. So, I mean, make of that what you will. But as far as suspects go, there was really 2 major ones in this case. One was a man named Christopher Wilder, who was a serial killer who was known to be operating in Florida at the time, and John Crutchley, who was another serial killer operating in this area at this time. So yeah, lots of murder happening in Florida. Both of these men were investigated and were kept as suspects, all the way up until their deaths in 1984 and 2002 respectively. And obviously, these men were never charged for Tammy's disappearance or death, and if they did know anything, they ended up taking it to their graves. Another theory was that at this party that Tammy attended, she either saw or heard something that she shouldn't have seen or heard, and thought that someone would potentially kidnap or kill her in order to protect their secret. And she may honestly have been right on that one. Now, again, in relation to the party that she went to, there were some people who thought, some, rumors going around, that Tammy, at the time of her disappearance, was actually 3 months pregnant, which, might explain why after the party, Tammy seemed a little shaken, a little traumatized almost. And perhaps, maybe whoever did this to her found out she was pregnant, wanted to cover things up. And again, this was never confirmed, it was just kind of rumors and theories, but it is a possibility. After Tammy went missing, obviously searches were started, investigations were done, interviews were done, but Tammy just never turned up, and they never really found any evidence for where she might have gone, who might have taken her, what else might have happened. And some of the biggest evidence actually that they got were these 2 phone calls, and they were from a lady saying that they knew that Tammy was alive and that she was basically in hiding and had, run away from all the attention and all of the showbiz, and that she would contact her loved ones when the time was right, which honestly, to me, just sounds like the biggest attempt at a cover-up ever. Like, it sounds like someone did something to Tammy, and then in order to make it seem like everything's fine, she just ran away, they made these calls, or they got someone else to make them on their behalf. Tammy, of course, never did turn up. She never did end up contacting anyone, so that makes the phone calls seem even more suspicious. And that's basically where the case ended up. As I said, the 2 major suspects died years later, and they were never really able to get any evidence of them, any confessions. So Tammy, still to this day, 40 years later, is still a missing person, and we have no idea what actually happened to her on that fateful day in Florida. The Caldwell Field murders was honestly a brutally sad case. It involved the murders of 2 students in Virginia, 18-year-old Heidi Childs and 19-year-old David Metzler. This all happened in 2009. It was a pretty nice and standard summer's day, and so David had, planned the date in Jefferson National Park. And the plan was basically to have like a picnic campfire of sorts. Shortly after dark, David would drive him and Heidi up to this park, start a small little fire, sit around it, play some guitar, super romantic stuff. They didn't plan on camping out there. They didn't plan on staying out too late, as both of them were pretty good students. They had a ton of work to do, and, they were pretty well behaved in general. So David's roommates kind of knew he would be back, later that evening. Heidi told her roommates basically the same thing. She'd be out for maybe a few hours and then would return home. And so that evening, just after dark, David went to pick Heidi up. Heidi ran out from her apartment, got in David's car, and they ended up going together to this national park. And then, come evening time, neither David nor Heidi returned home. At first, their roommates started to get a little bit worried, but they kind of thought, they are uni students. Maybe they stayed out a little bit later. Maybe David stayed over at Heidi's house, or like vice versa. Maybe they got a motel or a hotel somewhere, which was not too likely, but it also wasn't too unreasonable to imagine that either. So none of the roommates really did anything that night. But when they woke up the next day and still neither of them had returned, they started to get a little bit worried. Some of David's roommates went over to Heidi's place and checked with her roommates, and when they also said that neither of them had returned, then they decided to get in a car and drive up to the national park to search for the couple themselves. And just before they were able to do this, they received news that David and Heidi were found, and they had both been killed, both shot dead in the car park of the national park. They were found in the early morning by a man walking his dog, and for whatever reason, it is still completely unclear, they were both shot dead while either in or near their car. David was collapsed over the steering wheel, having been shot once through the driver's side window, and Heidi had collapsed just outside the car, likely, opening the door and making a run for it when David was shot. A bunch of Heidi's stuff was missing: her phone, her purse, her ID badge, and her camera, which seems to maybe lean to it being a robbery of sorts, but none of David's stuff was missing. He had his wallet still in his pocket, a bunch of cash still in the wallet. So, it seems like if you're killing 2 people over a robbery, that you would maybe at least take, everything. So it is kind of strange that David's stuff was still on him. And if you say, well, it was probably just a spur of the moment attack, they quickly tried to rob the couple, and then when they didn't comply, they shot them in a panic, you could say that. Except except for the fact that the murder weapon was a 30-30 hunting rifle, which is this fucking thing that looks like it's from the 1800s. It is a huge, clunky lever action rifle that is basically only used for hunting, and not exactly the type of weapon that you would take with you when going to rob someone. You know, it's not exactly small or conspicuous, it's rather clunky to use, and so there's theories that say that this was maybe a hunting accident gone wrong. Although at the time this happened, hunting season was already over. So was someone hunting illegally, and did David and Heidi potentially see them? But still, it seems absurd that someone would kill over just being spotted hunting illegally. You know, that seems to me like an absurd explanation. Or could it be that the explanation for this unusual weapon was that this was the only weapon that the killer could get their hands on? So one theory put forward that this was perhaps another student who, for whatever reason, wanted to kill David and Heidi, and maybe the only gun that they could get their hands on was something like their dad's hunting rifle or something, and so that's what they used. But still, it does seem a bit strange, because surely that would be something that would be easy to identify, easy to track, so that doesn't really seem like a satisfying answer either. Could it have been a completely random, completely wild, crazed attacker who, you know, just came out here with this random weapon and just attacked the first people he saw? That's always a possibility, I suppose. But that's basically all we have on this case. Possibilities and theories. There were no witnesses for this attack. As I said, the bodies were found many hours later in the morning. There was very little DNA evidence at the scene, and although there is a $100,000 reward for information leading to the solving of this case, that reward has never been claimed, and so this case, while still open, does remain a unfortunate, tragic, incredibly sad mystery. Chiho Anjitsu was the case of a 20-year-old swimming coach who went missing in Japan in 1992. And I owe a big part of my research on this case to a YouTuber named Kyoto Robato. There was very little evidence and information to find on this case, but Kyoto has done a fantastic job of grabbing it from all sorts of places and in compiling it into this super informative, super well put together video. So go check out his full video if you'd like. Link is down in the description below, and show Kyoto some love if you do go over there, and as always, let him know that Connor sent you. But this was in 1992 September, and on this day Chiho got up, drove to school like she normally did, and walked throughout the day, finishing at around 7 in the evening. She got in her car, left the school parking lot, and after this was never seen alive again. That evening, when she failed to come home, her family obviously got quite worried, so her mum called up the school, and they said that Chiho had basically left like normal, and she wasn't currently at the school. So that is a little worrying. Everything was seemingly from the school side completely normal, except for the fact that when Chiho left the car park, she left through the opposite exit that she normally takes. So towards one side is like the direction of her home, which is the exit she took pretty much every single day, and the other exit is, you know, basically going away from her home. So it seems like when Chiho left, she wasn't intending on going home, so the next obvious question was, where was she going? And I think more importantly, who was she meeting? So as we discussed, she left the parking lot at around 7 in the evening, and after she didn't come home and her mum got worried, the mum ended up going with Chiho's sister to the school to investigate, and they arrived there at around 10 in the evening. So it was around 3 hours after Chiho had left. And even though Chiho's car had been seen leaving the parking lot earlier in the day, when the mum and sister arrived, they were somewhat shocked to see Chiho's car seemingly still in the parking lot. Now, the car itself seemed to have been parked up in somewhat of a hurry. It was parked over like 2 parking bays, and the end of the car had smashed into the little bollard at the end of each parking space. So it seems like whoever parked up did so in somewhat of a hurry. So they thought this was very strange. The car was here, Chiho wasn't here, so they went up to the car to, you know, try and investigate, try and look for clues. And when they got there, looking through the window, they saw Chiho. And Chiho seemed to be asleep. She was reclined in one of the seats. And so the mum and sister tried to, knock on the window, wake Chiho up. And then eventually they opened the door and turned on the light in the car. And it was at this point that they realized that their daughter and sister, Chiho, was dead. They noticed she had marks on her neck, almost as if she'd been strangled. Her clothes were a little bit dirty, and immediately they ran to a nearby business, had them, call the authorities, the police, the ambulance, and I can't even imagine how tough it must have been for them. Soon after this, the police arrived, they started an investigation, they started looking for clues and evidence, and they found the things that I mentioned earlier, the dirt on Chiho's clothes, the strangulation marks around her neck, but they also noticed a bunch of dirt in the wheels of the car. So this, combined with the dirt and mud on Chiho's clothes, seemed to indicate that for some reason both Chiho and the car had very recently been off-road, whether that was in a field or a forest or a park, but somewhere that wasn't a road. So this essentially was their first clue as to where this attack might have taken place. So, they kind of put a large ring around the area as being the maximum distance that Chiho and the car might have traveled and then come back within this 3-hour time period. So they were doing their, searches, their investigation, but what really blew the case open wide was this little leaf that was found in Chiho's hair. And so police thought that if they could find the type of tree that it belonged to, this might help narrow down the area they need to search in. And this helped narrow it down more than they could ever imagine. The leaf belonged to a type of tree named a metasequoia, and this tree was so incredibly rare, like unbelievably rare, that it was thought to be extinct not too long ago. And the tree doesn't actually grow naturally in Japan, only in certain parts of China. So what the hell is going on here? Naturally, the police, using this evidence, started to look for places which might own metasequoias or might be able to grow them, and almost immediately they found a testing facility that actually had some metasequoias growing somewhat nearby. In fact, incredibly nearby, as this is a map of Chiho's home, the testing facility, and the swimming school, so all very nearby one another. So police then drove over to this testing facility, cordoned off the whole area, and they found there one of Chiho's shoes and some of Chiho's hair, basically confirming that this is where the attack took place. Now, in the further investigations and in trying to paint an entire picture of what happened that night, these were a few of the things that the police had noted. One, the fact that the car had been returned to the school meant that this wasn't just some random attack. Like, the killer, after killing Chiho, knew exactly where she taught, and if you remember earlier, the killer parked over to parking bays, number 2 and number 3, and Chiho's regular parking spot was in number 2. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the killer likely tried to return the car to the exact same parking spot as would normally be expected. But obviously he was in a rush, he went over the parking bays, and he hit into the concrete bollard at the back. So the fact that the killer knew all of this information meant that perhaps the killer was a colleague, was a friend of Chiho's, was a potential lover that she had, been discussing things with, or been someone that had, stalked her, watched her, seen where she works, seen exactly where she parked. But if that was the case, then it's unclear who Chiho was meeting that day, as nobody else came forward as, having a date or having an appointment with her. So it seems like whoever she went out to meet, that this person was the killer, and not just a random person that was, on the street or ambushed her or something like that. Now, she wasn't known to have a boyfriend at the time, but then again, it's not too unusual, especially in Japan, for people to, date or go out on dates or talk about things before introducing them to their friends and family as like an official boyfriend sort of thing. And so with Chiho leaving at around 7 p.m. and the car being returned by around 9 p.m, this leaves Chiho and the car gone for what, 2 hours? So the obvious question is, what exactly happened in these 2 hours? Well, the most common thought, just based on witness testimony, based on people seeing the car, that Chiho left the school parking lot and ended up driving to a restaurant where she, for whatever reason, and whoever, ended up meeting someone, which I think the police are implying that this was a planned meeting. So she had arranged to meet someone at this restaurant. The person, whoever she met, ended up getting into the driver's seat. She got into the passenger seat of her car, and then together, for whatever reason, they ended up driving to this area with the meta sequoia tree. Now, along this little road that the meta sequoia tree was on, there were a bunch of motels and hotels, and the road itself is actually known for containing all of these motels. So one theory, one version or story of events, was that Chiho went to meet a potential date or her potential boyfriend at this restaurant. The boyfriend said, look, let's take a drive somewhere, ended up driving to this area full of motels, had some, untoward thoughts, maybe tried to pressure Chiho into booking into one of the hotels with him, and maybe when she said no, that she didn't want to, he ended up getting mad, getting frustrated, and driving the two to this secluded area where he seemingly had his way with her. Her clothes were torn in the abdomen section, as well as, below the abdomen. So they seemingly arrived there. Whatever happened. Chiho was likely strangled with the straps on her own clothes, and then the killer put her back in the car, drove all the way back to the swimming pool car park, left the car there, and disappeared. Now, as I said, this is partly evidential, partly speculation. We don't have too much evidence for this, but it seems like the likely progression of events. And for this case, during the investigation, there were thousands and thousands of potential suspects, which they slowly narrowed down to first a few thousand, then a little bit less than 1,000, then just a few hundred, and then just really a handful. But they were never able to prove that it was just one person, and so that is basically as far as the case got. Sadly, with there just being no witnesses, not enough evidence, the police just soon enough came to a dead end, and this case was never solved. And the police chief who was in charge of this investigation actually later wrote a book titled Sorry Chiho, in which he goes into detail about one particular suspect who he believes almost 100% was responsible for Chiho's death, and he said he has always felt guilt about not being able to bring this man to justice. He called the man Yamada as like a cover name because he didn't want to give away his identity for legal purposes, because it wasn't proven that this guy killed Chiho. But Yamada was basically a suspect right from the start, but he gave an alibi, so police moved on to someone else. But then his blood type matched some of the DNA found at the scene, so they went back to Yamada, did some more investigating, and found that his original alibi was quite likely false. But then they couldn't really get any more evidence on him, and so it was kind of this back and forth where they were barely not able to convict him. Like, as I said, the police chief was convinced it was him, and just with a little more evidence really, they would probably be able to convict him. But that never did end up happening. All of the evidence was either non-existent or circumstantial, and because Yamada never confessed to the crime, he was in the end just never charged. And that is where this case currently sits. And interestingly and somewhat disturbingly enough, when this case happened in 1992, the law in Japan actually had a statute of limitations on murder, meaning even on murder, if the case wasn't solved after 15 years, then it was basically as if the case and the murder had never happened. After 15 years, no one could be charged for it, even if they came forward and confessed to it and provided evidence for it, they still couldn't legally be convicted. This is absolutely fucking nuts, and it was quite rightfully changed in 2010, where now there is no statute of limitations on murder. But as of 2007, exactly 15 years after this murder, the case was officially closed, and even if someone today comes forward and confesses to it, there's nothing the police or the law can do to charge them with it. So actually, justice can never be served, and the case can never be solved because it technically doesn't exist anymore because of this crazy law. So a wild one, a strange one, a brutal one, and I hope Chiho finds some peace wherever she might be. Jason Jolkowski was a 19-year-old guy who went missing from his home state of Nebraska in 2001. He was a part-time student who also worked in a restaurant, and he had a shift in the restaurant on that day, and because his car was in the shop at the time, he decided to just walk the 4 miles from his house to the restaurant. Then one of his co-workers was like, "No, dude, that is way too far to walk. Let me give you a ride." And so Jason accepted the ride, and that's basically what they planned to do. The co-worker said that he would pick him up at one of the nearby schools, which meant a lot less walking for Jason. And so Jason, that morning, that afternoon, left his home, made his way to the local school, which is just like a few blocks away. But when his co-worker got to the school, Jason was nowhere to be seen. So he drove to Jason's house, and they basically said that Jason had left on time to go to the school. So something was clearly up. They reported Jason missing. They checked all the cameras at the school and saw that Jason never actually made it that far, and that was the last time that he was ever seen. He disappeared somewhere, sometime between his home and I guess the local school, but where he went, who else might have been involved, we still to this day don't know. Jason wasn't this dodgy kid, and the disappearance wasn't in the middle of the night. It was like literally in broad daylight. Jason was also a 6'1" guy, so the idea of someone, manhandling him on the street again in broad daylight and kidnapping him, throwing him into a car, all seems like incredibly absurd. And then also what they might have done with him afterwards, is also a little strange. Like, if you're kidnapping someone like this, maybe you leave a ransom note or demand a ransom, but absolutely none of that happened. It's like he just vanished into thin air. The other potential explanation is of Jason running away, but he didn't really seem like the running away type. He had a family there, he had his friends, he had a job, he had his school that he was working on, and his younger brother, which for him to leave all of that behind without telling anyone is also a little strange. And so that is basically where the case sits today. There's not too much evidence at all for this one, and Jason's whereabouts are still unknown, and he is still to this day considered a missing person. Nicole Morin was an 8-year-old girl who went missing in 1985 in Toronto, Canada. She was at the time living here with her mum on the 20th floor of this apartment complex, and at around 11 a.m. on this fine summer's day, she had planned to go swimming with one of her friends, and this friend was also living in the same building. The pool that they had planned to go swimming at was a pool at the back of the complex, so they didn't really have to leave the property to go and access it. So Nicole got ready, she left her home, and she was all, kitted out for swimming. She was in a swimsuit, she had a towel, she had goggles. But 5 minutes later, Nicole's friend buzzed up to Nicole's mum's apartment and said basically, "I'm here, where's Nicole? She hasn't come to meet me yet." And Nicole's mum basically said, she's probably gone to the pool herself, or she's out back playing with the other kids, and was like, go and see where she is, sort of thing. Her mum at the time was running a daycare, and so I guess she thought she didn't really have time to be messing around with this, which, it's like finding your own daughter. But I guess in her head, she thought that Nicole was safe somewhere, and so she didn't report Nicole missing for another 4 hours. And of course, when she reported her, she wasn't in the pool, she wasn't in the back of the complex, she wasn't in the lobby, she wasn't anywhere. And so obviously the police were called, the area was cordoned off, searches were started, investigations were started, and it ended up becoming one of the biggest missing person searches in Toronto history. They set up roadblocks all over the areas and stopped cars and traffic. They knocked on and searched every single door and apartment in the building, and they poured tens of thousands of man-hours into this investigation and spent millions of dollars on it in just the first year alone. There was a reward set up for $100,000 to anyone with any information leading to Nicole's safe return. Her dad quit his job, and he and Nicole's mum ended up moving back in together and basically dedicating their entire lives to finding Nicole, which is absolutely understandable. But despite years of investigations and private investigators and clues and interviews, no headway has ever really been made in this case. The security cameras show that Nicole went down an elevator down into the lobby, and then just nothing. No physical evidence was ever collected in regards to Nicole's disappearance, except for a very strange note that was found in Nicole's apartment, on which Nicole had handwritten months earlier, "I'm going to disappear," which is awfully strange, and they never really came to a conclusive answer for this clue. No DNA evidence was ever found, no real suspects were ever developed, and this case, while currently still open, is considered a cold case, and Nicole, almost 40 years later, is still considered a missing person. And that is all we have time for. Now, you know I don't like to end these videos on such tragic cases such as this, but it is just the end of the tier. The full complete tier will be released soon enough, and please everyone, stay happy, stay healthy, look after yourselves, and as always, thanks for watching.